Hi, and welcome to the latest edition of Building Brand Gravity. I'm Steve Halsey, Principal and Chief Growth Officer of GNS, and your host of Building Brand Gravity. With me today are two renowned communications experts. I want to first welcome back to the show Rob Jekielek, Managing Director of the Harris Poll. Rob is a world-renowned expert on reputation, brand, and insights, and he's a leader at the iconic Harris Poll. Rob, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Glad to be here.
We're also joined by Eliot Mizrachi. He's VP of Strategy and Content for Page. In that role, Eliot works with the world's top CCOs, agency executives, academics, and other leaders supporting the C-suite. He's actively gleaning their insights, and he's using that to create compelling thought leadership content that helps today's chief communication officers navigate an ever more complex world. Eliot, welcome to Building Brand Gravity.
Thank you, Steve.
So, hey, let's get started. It's going to be a great discussion today. And it's not going to be a light discussion. You know, when you think about what we're facing in the world right now, the context around and the expectations of business is anything but stable. You got seismic forces of change, you got mass disruption, you got geopolitical unrest, economic headwinds, disinformation, polarization, and the need for personalization are the norm today, right? Just a couple of small things for us to deal with, you know, and Rob can bring that into greater light in terms of what they're seeing at the Harris Poll. And from where Eliot sits in this environment, today's chief communication officers are being asked to not just lead the communications function, but to help their companies, their markets, and even society manage some kind of positive transformation in the face of these disruptive forces. So in today's podcast, we're going to explore what's on the mind of CCOs, what the research tells us. We're going to talk about two big issues that chief communications officers cannot afford to ignore, and how this moment in time is going to forever change the role of the CCO. And all of this is going to be discussed within the context of how it could impact a brand's gravity. So, Eliot, Page recently polled 38 member CCOs in North America, Europe, and the Middle East to see what's on their mind. What did you find out?
Well, a little bit of the history before I get to the findings, Steve. So we're a membership association for chief communication officers. And one of the things that we have been trying to do lately is have more of a voice and more of a presence in business conversations. And we, for the last couple of years, have had a presence at Davos. And to prepare for that, one of the things that we wanted to do was reach out to members and get a sense for what was on their mind. I often like to think about the CCO as the organizational antenna. You know, we have sight lines and views into what's happening around the organization, around the world, with stakeholders. And this lets CCOs be early detectors of risk. And so we did two things in our research. We spoke to CCOs, which I'll talk about. And we also worked with Rob to speak with the public and understand what their expectations are around issue management. And Rob will share a little bit of those findings in a moment. What we found when we asked CCOs, what are the things that you're thinking about? What are the risks that you see coming up in the year to come? 45% said that it was geopolitics and elections. And I don't know if you know this, about half the planet is going to be going to the polls in Democratic elections this year. It is an enormously consequential year for Democratic politics, and it's happening at a time that there is enormous polarization and divisiveness. And in fact, 29% of CCOs said that that's their second greatest risk: the polarization, divisiveness, the eroding societal fabric. And so when I think about these two things together, I'm thinking, CCOs, their job is in many ways to protect the social license to operate. And when you are dealing with a world that is fragmented and decisive and where constructive dialogue is breaking down, it becomes more challenging to do that, to find those forms of common ground. We look at blowback on ESG and DEI, things that many would agree are forms of responsible business management, but they've become wrapped up in sort of political language and rhetoric. And it's challenged CCOs in their ability to lead their enterprises on those sorts of issues.
Quick question off that. Are they optimistic or are they pessimistic as they think about the current situation?
We didn't ask, so your guess would be as good as mine. But my experience with CCOs, honestly, is that considering the challenges they face day to day, they are a strangely optimistic bunch. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity that sits within these challenges. There's a lot of opportunity that lends itself to this unique skill set of the CCO to foster constructive dialogue and find common ground. And I think I'll add these two quick points. 14% felt that misinformation and disinformation were also huge risks this year. And all of that stuff goes to the heart of this earning and building and maintaining trust. On the positive side, we asked, what are the opportunities that you see for the function coming up in the coming year? 32% said that it was about evolution to the function itself, more personalization, more speed, more scale, a greater ability to demonstrate real, tangible value. 26% talked about AI, which anyone would agree is probably a mixed bag, but tremendous opportunity to deepen the relationships that we have with stakeholders and have a greater impact. And so I think, to your point, Steve, even though these are enormous societal challenges, CCOs have greater opportunities than ever before to be positive, influential forces in their organizations and outside as well.
And what are you seeing as you talk to them about just how the skill set's expanding? I mean, everything you covered, geopolitics, AI, changing role, dealing with elections, all of these things to try and shepherd the brands. I mean, how are they keeping up with this? How are they thinking about their teams in that environment?
Well, I would like to think that one of the ways that we do it is by participating in page events and consuming our content. But the bottom line is this. I think the expectation of the CCO to have the broadest purview possible is really significant today. And I think that business acumen, that understanding of world events and how they affect the enterprise, I think that's probably the most important thing that CCOs are focusing on, just so they have a really rich understanding of the context and an ability to provide valuable strategic advice.
That's interesting. And Rob, I know you guys worked with him, as he said, on kind of the qualitative part of this, but the Harris Poll also recently worked with Page to field a global public opinion survey, really asking about the confidence in business. You garnered responses from more than 11,000 individuals across 10 markets. What did you find out?
Thanks, Steve. I really enjoyed Eliot's setup, and I think your question, Steve, about the CCO psyche, I can't hold back from kind of jumping in. I think I think Eliot would agree. Like a lot of CCOs, I think the tolerance or maybe appetite for kind of complexity and maybe borderline pain is an impressive trait. I would say that, because people know what they're getting in for, and they keep coming back more for more of it. And honestly, I think it's just what's that?
It's a survival trait.
Oh, yeah, but it's not just survival, right? I mean, I think a lot of people, there's a lot of people that I have the opportunity to deal with that are in senior communications roles. I mean, they could be doing a lot of different things across the business, right? And in many cases, they've opted in and really selected to be running communications. So again, I think it's a very certain persona that does it. And really kind of such an invaluable skill to the points that both of you were making, and really what a lot of the research that I'll talk about indicates. It's, being that antenna and being that guidepost for how things are changing is it's just so mission critical, because companies today have larger blind spots and more quickly emerging blind spots than they've ever had before. So the research that we did with Page, and again, I will give Eliot kudos here. He was certainly kind of the instigator and brainchild behind getting this. He prompted us along to really kind of sprint towards the end of last year. And it was really a brain trust of Eliot, the Page team, and as well as a number of Page members that contributed to the survey. So it covers 10 global markets, kind of across the board from North America to Latin America to across Europe and Asia. A little lighter this round on the Middle East and Africa, but we'll address that in a future wave. But I think a really interesting set of insights when you're talking to over 11,000 members of the global public, right? And really starting to get your head around, what are the issues that matter most? And the two core questions that we focused in are first, what are the issues that the public expects business to make an impact on, which are most important? And the second one is around how confident are they that business actually can deliver positive value, right? So and it plays very, very well with some of the thematics that Eliot alluded to. First, I'll start with some of just maybe a couple kind of core insights around key issues, but the politicization and polarization is such an apparent trend in the research. I'll talk maybe a little bit about the U.S., where it's maybe the point and the gap is particularly wide, but it's very noteworthy that you're seeing these gaps across the board, right? So as you're tracking some of these elections, whether they're more at the national level or more at the regional level or more at the municipal level, like there's countries like the UK where you've had certainly some what people would say some startling results in terms of people who are now in parliament, right? I think you've had some similar trends across a number of European markets. But back to the overall data, right? So as you're looking at this whole idea of confidence and importance of issues, first and foremost, the issues that we picked are highly salient to the public. And again, I put a lot of this back to the brain trust that helped support. Over 80% of the global public, on average, said the 15 issues that we dug into were highly important for business to work on. So all the issues within the study, some of them might be higher, some of them might be lower, are all very salient when it comes to the public. The current reality is that the gap between kind of importance, which call that around 80 as the global average, versus confidence is pretty substantial. It's about 26 points. You're at 54, 55 in terms of looking at the level of confidence. So many issues of high importance, confidence substantially lower. So reinforcing this whole idea of a confidence gap.
And Rob, just to reinforce for our listeners, importance is what the audience viewed of the ranking of the issue, and confidence was their confidence in how business would address that.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty literally, it's when you look at each one of these issues, such as economic stability and growth, or income inequality, or gender equality, or polarization in society, to what degree would you say it's important for business to make a positive impact on it? And then secondarily, how confident are you that business can make a positive impact on it? Okay, so very business centric, not just personally are these issues in the world important to you, but we very much brought that direct business lens on it, right? Is this something that you feel business should be addressing, and do you believe that business can address it or not?
Great, thank you.
Cool. So globally, what's noteworthy is that there are two issues that really stood out as kind of the bedrocks for engagement. And the reason I say that is that both these issues stood out as being both the two most important, as well as amongst the highest on confidence, right? Those two issues are economic stability and growth, right? So the degree to which you can have a positive impact on the economy and enable growth. And the second one is job creation and workforce skills development. Right. So very much around the workforce, accelerating job creation, but also really looking at your workforce and the degree to which you can improve its skills looking forward. Both of those were very close to 90% of the public saying very important in terms of the global public across those 10 markets. And there you had the confidence numbers in the low to mid 60s, right? So substantially higher than the average, and really kind of two standout items. So those are, and what's particularly noteworthy is those two issues across every market and across every key kind of demographic cut very consistently stay as the bedrock, if you will.
Well, that's fascinating, giving all the changes within geographies, and Eliot was talking about all of the elections and the polarization of liberal, conservative, young, old, urban, rural. Those are definitely interesting findings that I want to come back to. And Eliot, I want to turn to you for a little bit. I mean, Rob is sitting there saying, hey, universally around the globe, there's these two issues. Actually, there's 15 issues that ranked pretty high, but there were two that were up near 90%, the economic stability and growth, job creation, and workforce skills. So two-part questions for you. And then as we get later in the podcast, we'll come back here. First, given everything Rob just covered in terms of the findings from the CCOs you talk to, how do they reconcile it all? And second, with so much of the day-to-day focus in the news, at least here in the US and a lot of Western Europe, on what divides us, how can CCOs help their companies and their key publics get aligned around their brand's core values and business outcomes in this environment?
Yeah, Steve, on your first question, how do they do it? It is not easy. One of the things that we've been tracking really closely since the beginning of 2020. As COVID came about, we started getting members together to talk about what they were going through and share knowledge with each other. And it just seems like the expectations and the issues that they're dealing with and trying to manage have grown beyond their budgets and teams. And so they're spread really thin. Their remits are expanding. We find CCOs whose responsibilities have come to include brand and marketing, ESG, sustainability, in some cases, human resources, culture. And so what we see is a real evolution of the nature of the function. And to be honest, Steve, I think like, any growing pains, it's been challenging for CCOs to keep up with all of these issues. But what I will say, just on the kind of divisiveness, one of the things that Paige has said for many, many years is when you think about the basis of the CCO's role, it is rooted in this idea of corporate character, that every organization has character, a set of values and beliefs, a unique and differentiated identity that govern everything that it is and does and says. And the CCO's role is to define what that character is and to help align the organization around it. And sometimes that's an ongoing process of refinement when there's a really strong sense of what that is. In other cases, that could mean that there's an existential reality around the company that requires what our friend John Iwata at Yale recently described as refounding moments where you need to step back and say, this company needs to be something entirely different. And so building a shared belief around what is happening around the company and what needs to happen in order to move it forward is really essential. We did an executive education program with Yale based on their approach to stakeholder capitalism and Paige's research on the topic. And one of the things that we talked about was assessing materiality. Companies, even though there might be an expectation from some stakeholders to engage on a whole host of issues, as Rob's research shows us, some of those issues are more material than others. Things like economic growth and job skills, these are things that people expect of companies more than some other issues. And so the role for the CCO here is to be a unifying figure, to be at the center of kind of integrating various perspectives, to find common ground with stakeholders, and to be a force for ensuring that corporate character is constant and pervasive, that it's ever evident in everything that a company does and says. And that's a big job.
Yeah, that certainly is a big job. And Rob, I want to get to you in a second about the impact of AI and some unique things you had there, but kind of reacting to what Eliot said there as he was talking about the challenge of the CCO. I thought this was really interesting in your research because Eliot was talking about those acronym ESG, DE&I. And what I thought was interesting, and you may have like a broader perspective on this outside of this study, but what was interesting was you hear that and you see that, and it's like reflected in a lot of the financial news. Yeah, Alan Murray's thing is he's really struggling with that, back and forth. But then when I look at the actual survey you have and the way you ask questions, when you break them out of the acronym, how important is racial minority equity or equality? That's at like 78%. Income inequality, like 81%. You're seeing a lot of these things, gender equality at like 77%. What was interesting to me is when you break them out of the acronym, how high they actually score in importance, but then there's a mix on confidence. And I just wasn't sure if you had any perspective on people's viewpoint. Once you break it out of the acronym, it seems like they generally support, these big concepts that business is basically challenged to manage.
Yeah, I think you're very squarely getting to one of the biggest risks kind of across the board. I'd say, especially if you're sitting in a U.S. boardroom right now, one of the biggest risks, reputational risks, which again I think right now are higher on the board agenda than they've ever been, is very much around this kind of polarization and politicization of issues. One of the things that's become very apparent is if you have a term and one of your terms is like three different things. That are very kind of none of which really indicate any sort of a benefit, but are just kind of functional descriptions. The level of jargon is substantial, and the ability for people to turn that term into whatever they want it to be is quite high, right? And in contrast to that, to the point you're getting at, Steve, and I think you can get even more detailed, is as you look at a lot of the underlying elements, if you ask, the public or other stakeholders, right, is it important for companies to have a positive impact on the environment or not a negative impact on the environment, to improve the communities where they work and operate and their employees live, to have very strong governance practices? You have overwhelming yeses, right? But along those issues, there's certainly, if you laddered up to something called ESG or other terms like D&I, they for sure, like most people don't even understand what those things mean, right? But there's people that have told them that they're horrible and they're like the end of capitalism, they're the end of civilization, et cetera. But so you turn it from kind of a concrete conversation on what we're doing to showcase progress to kind of very much a philosophical, jargony, highly heated, emotional debate, right? So yes, the specifics matter when you look within the research, even on those issues, right? I think it's particularly noteworthy. We look at the data split a lot of the different ways, like for example, by age, by political leaning, by urbanicity, like urban rural. You do see some pretty substantial differences, right? So, but in terms of importance, you have a lot more consistency. The confidence numbers do differ substantially if you're looking at, for example, globally liberal versus more conservative. In the U.S., very specifically, Democrat versus Republican. But also to the point you're getting at, Steve, none of those numbers, they didn't drop to like 20% importance or something, right? So I think one of the biggest takeaways, one of the big privileges of working with Page, and especially on this project, is we've had a chance to talk with a lot of Page members in different countries on this, right? And one of the main takeaways is not, oh, like we should just stay silent on everything except those two issues. That's not the case, right? It's more so saying we need to start with those two issues. If we don't reinforce our credibility and our competence on those things and jump over to other issues, then people might question where our priorities are and like, are we actually good at the foundation of what we do or not, right? Versus if we're able to move off those very quickly and ideally showcase through our business, through our hiring, how we're actually improving a lot of these issues and being very specific about that progress, there's a huge opportunity, right? So, and I think that's one of the things that when we look at the, CCOs, especially over the last 2-3 years, there's for sure been, coming out of many boards, an emphasis on like, we really shouldn't just talk about any of these things. Right. Versus, what most of the research would indicate is we just need to be much more specific about what we're saying. Right. If this is something we really believe in, how are we showing that that we've made progress on it versus just talking about it being something that is broadly important?
So Eliot, in the conversations you're having with chief communication officers around the globe, is that what you're hearing, that they're really looking at how do we illustrate and isolate these key issues, start a little bit at the common ground, and then get into more specifics in terms of what the brand is doing?
I think what I would say is we're starting to see more methodical approaches to deciding whether and how to engage on these issues. There was, I think, around the time of George Floyd and in the, 18 months after, it felt like there was just an expectation that if there was an issue, companies needed to have a position and to be vocal on it, that was just the new norm. And I think since a couple of instances where that's gone awry, companies have been understandably more judicious about it. What we see CCOs doing is being more methodical about interpreting the relevance of an issue, both the relevance of an issue to the organization and its stakeholders, but also the relevance of the organization and its stakeholders to the issue, and whether or not there really is a place and an impact that they can have. And so I think it's not a question of, trying to do less or kind of duck your head. It's a question of having a really reliable, repeatable, consistent process of making decisions about what is our posture on these different issues, what actions can we take to make progress on those issues. And we see CCOs stepping up to use data and input from various stakeholders to make better decisions along those lines.
No, that's great. Now, the one thing you missed, Eliot, you didn't say AI. How can we have a conversation without bringing in the word AI? And Rob, you mentioned to me the other day that you see these two dueling trends of like one of the economic stability and two, that job creation and skills development as a huge opportunity for brands, specifically as it relates to an area like talent development. So given the overlay of AI's dramatic impact on seemingly, well, everything, you've got like, there's a myriad of views, but there's, one side is, purely dystopian scenarios, predicting computers are going to take over, a la the Terminator. That's it. We're done. We release, AI. You have others that are out there really fearing about the loss of jobs and becoming obsolete. And what I find interesting, and you're seeing it daily in the business media, is that there are roles that were highly skilled that were traditionally somewhat insulated, specialties like law, like accounting, even investing, that are now facing AI. And, are those individuals even needed anymore? And then there's another view of this that basically says, no, AI is going to be a positive game changer in productivity and innovation. All those rote tasks that both blue collar and white collar workers were doing, they're going to be taken care of by AI so they can focus on higher value tasks. So within that myriad of things and those often conflicting viewpoint, you had kind of a viewpoint of what you saw as an uncharted opportunity for brands and corporation as it relates to the workforce. Do you mind sharing a little bit of that?
Yeah, so I'll do two things. One is I'll point to a couple pieces of the data, and then I'll pivot off that quick. Right. First, one of the first things I would say is when you're looking at AI, and especially some of in terms of the research, is some of the negative impacts of it. Right. The negative impacts of AI was one of the things that trended higher. I will say it's interesting that, and this has come through in conversations we've had in places like China versus the UK versus the US. The negative impacts conversation is also very different in different markets, right? It is, if you're living in Canada or the US or the UK, it is so prevalent, right? Versus in other markets, like AI is more of just kind of like a layer that's there, and many people have maybe more confidence being it's dealt with. I think the bigger and more important and the point that you're laddering up to is when you look at the intersection in those two issues, we're very drawn to the second aspect of that second issue, right, which is around skills development, right? And I think it's like one of your massive opportunities right now is very much around, how does AI kind of enable a culture shift, right? And what are the skills that are required, right, versus just a sprint to embed as much AI as possible. Right. I think very quickly, like if you look at most companies and the amount of dollars that they're putting into kind of developing new kind of AI programs versus overall kind of like improving skills and talent for the next generation, the level of investment in one versus the other is substantial, right? So as we're looking at companies, and we're looking at for most companies, still your intellectual capital is your number one asset. If you're looking forward, the companies that can really win on employees are going to win in the marketplace. I think that skills piece is a massive opportunity and across a lot of different research we're doing. But the research here highlights it is, our ability to tell a story about and through our employees about the future and showcase that through how our business operates is like massive. And it's a very human story too, right? I think that's one of the key things that, as communicators and as storytellers, human stories work much better than jargony technical stories, right?
So Eliot, you definitely have your thoughts on AI. And as you're talking to CCOs around the globe, and what Rob was really talking about, the challenges or the opportunities, what's the viewpoint from CCOs?
You really kicked the hornet's nest with me. I really could go on. I thought long and hard about what I wanted to say just to keep it contained. There's a few things that I would say. I think certainly CCOs, just like any function today, they are thinking really hard about how to capitalize on the advantages that AI can present. And I've got some thoughts about how all that's going to unfold. I think maybe that's a conversation for another day. But one of the issues that relates to the research that Rob and Harris did is there's a real concern about job displacement and this idea that AI is going to disrupt, labor markets and the ability to people to work. I think it's more likely that AI, like a lot of technologies that came before it, are going to transform the way that we work, but expectations will increase. So it won't be that you only need one person to do the work that 5 people did before. It's that those 5 people will be able to do different forms and higher value of work. And it takes time to get there. It reminds me of Brittany Paxman, who's the principal at Point 600, she often uses this example of the vacuum cleaner, that when it was introduced in the 50s, housewives everywhere rejoiced that this is going to, create so much more free time for them because it'll be so much easier to clean the house. But what actually ended up happening was the expectations of home cleanliness increased. And so they found themselves busier rather than less busy. And I wonder if that'll be the same here. In terms of what I think the positive developments of AI and managing the negative potential, I think one of the things that organizations really struggle with, they've struggled with always, is there's so much knowledge that's locked within the community, the organization, in little pockets of specializations and expertise. And it's really difficult to make that knowledge accessible across the entire organization. I think companies will begin to develop their own proprietary AI models that are a combination of ChatGPT plus all their own data. So no matter where you sit in the organization, you can have a chatbot and you can find the information, the data, the policy, whatever you're looking for. All of that stuff will be readily available. And I think that creates a huge opportunity for people to be more productive and impactful. But I think for CCOs, one of the things that's flying under the radar that I think is really important is AI is dumb. People don't realize it is a machine. It is garbage in, garbage out. And it operates on the basis of what we choose to train it on. And those are human decisions. That's why we see so much bias in AI. It's not because the AI is flawed. It's how we're training it. And so, there's this thought experiment around the paperclip that if you told AI, maximize the production of paperclips, it would kill us all because it knows nothing else than maximize the production of paperclips. What I think CCOs need to do is think about this reality that you need to have a moral and ethical and a responsible adoption of AI, one that minimizes its potential for harm and maximizes its opportunity to create value. And I think a lot of that is going to come down to CCOs who have the reputation and brand safety as part of their remit. Nobody wants to be the company that's caught in some, major kerfluffle because they didn't think through the implications of AI. And so I think this is the beginning of a really long transition period where a lot of these issues will reveal themselves, and CCOs are going to help their organizations navigate through them.
Well, and I think part of the challenge of that with CCOs is to remain innately human, right? There's certain aspects of really the communications function or the expanding remit where it sits, that understanding of context, that understanding of emotion, that understanding of timing, are very difficult to be done by the machine. So it's going to be interesting to see how those are done in tandem.
I mean, it's just also to the whole point that Eliot made at the beginning, right? Scarce resources. Like, although there's these bigger things around organizational change, if comms teams don't get on technology and AI fast, it's a huge miss, right? I mean, there's just so many like basic enablers that it provides right now. Because to the point I think you're making there at the end is human context and insights are still very human things, right? Like we do a lot of insights work, we use tons of AI now to accelerate processes, but you never have AI giving you the insight at the end of the chain, right? It's always a set of humans and interpretation and context and the humans they're delivering to. So,
well, and what I think's interesting about that point, Rob, is I feel like the human context is constantly evolving, and individually, at a family level, at a community, at a national level. Things are not static. And some of, the research I've seen you present that 10 years ago, certain attitudes and viewpoints you would have assumed would be the U.S. context, Republican nature in terms of confidence and view on corporations are now more of a Democratic viewpoint, and things that 10 years ago was a Democratic viewpoint could be a Republican viewpoint. So, that's also important as you think about what you were talking about of those human insights, the context and emotions. We're not a static species as much as some folks might think we are.
Yep, exactly. No, very clear. It's 180 degrees on kind of how different political branches in the U.S. think about business. 100%. So,
have either of you heard of the turkey problem? Do you know what that is?
No.
It's maybe a little too American. But the turkey problem is the idea that if you're a turkey, you wake up every day, you get fed, you stand in the sun. Every day is wonderful. You got nothing to worry about until one day in November. That day is very different for you. And you didn't see it coming because your experience up to that point had been the same every day. And I think that this goes to the point about the human elements, that the systems, if they're trained on all the data in the world, everything that's been written up till today, they know what's known and they can maybe extrapolate and interpret, and that's really powerful. But I think humans' ability to be more creative about the possibilities is always going to be an essential supplement to what the technology can do to supplement it. So, the turkey problem is something that's always going to be the case. And I think CCOs as leaders, as antennas, we've got that broad purview and an opportunity to help the organization see more broadly than maybe historical data can show us.
As you both kind of talked about that, I guess it really struck me. A lot of this really takes it to the core of the CCO's job and remit from what it's been since the CCOs were created, which is how do you blend the art and science, right? And I think when you're talking about the impact of AI and these type of things, the science part of it and the ability to aggregate, create new things, there's more science than ever that they have to deal with, but there's also the art of how do you put this together in a meaningful way that is true to your brand, true to your values, true to what you're seeing with a landscape, and you hope you get it right. So, a couple of questions. I could talk to you guys for hours on these topics, but I want to kind of bring us back to a lot of what we've covered here. Eliot, you really started talking about, you've got this expanding remit of chief communication officers. Half the world, at least half the Democratic world, is in election this year. But those that aren't Democratic doesn't mean that there's not geopolitical issues or challenges that are being created around the world. You've got technology, you've got innovation. You've got the research that you guys did with the Harris poll. We're really talking about economic stability, growth, job creation, workforce skills. That's an awful lot. So what closing advice does Paige have for chief communication officers and senior communications professionals on how to make the most out of this moment of time?
I think if I were to narrow it, and this is my advice, the first is businesses operate in a much more multi-stakeholder environment today. And what I mean by that is the risks associated with not engaging with, understanding, and orienting the organization around the interests and concerns of all of their stakeholders present greater challenges today. Stakeholder capitalism is a thing today because various publics have expectations of business that they need to fulfill. And CCOs are the multi-stakeholder function. We have the broadest purview across the stakeholder universe. And so I think navigating those realities and making sure that there's a balance across stakeholders is really essential. And as I said earlier, there's the second piece of advice, there's more methodical approaches to doing that. I think communications functions today, they're synthesizing data and input and just the reality of events of the world, and they're able to develop a point of view about the valence of the organization to certain issues and activities, but also the valence of those activities and issues to the organization. And I think having a consistent, repeatable process that's reliable becomes really important because once you set a precedent, it's hard to kind of back off of that. The third thing I would say is, and this sounds a little airy-fairy, but I mean it genuinely, business has, this kind of goes to the multi-stakeholder view, business has a unique opportunity to make the world better. Nobody started a business purely because they wanted to make money. They started a business because they saw a problem, a way to create value, a way to make life better or lives better. And the better companies can connect to that core purpose, that animating purpose, and accentuate it and amplify it, I think the more likely it is that they will be able to build lasting, positive relationships with stakeholders. And again, CCOs are at the center of that. You think about corporate character, the purpose is often at the center of that identity of the organization. Why we get out of bed every morning and go to work to do the work that we do. Why employees want to stay with our companies and remain engaged in their work is because they feel and they see and they know that the work that we're doing is somehow making the world a better place. And for communicators, it's about telling that story, certainly, but it's about making sure that you also have that story to tell. And that's about organizational change. And what we see at CCOs today is the communications are, the last mile, right? The 25.2 miles that come earlier in the marathon are about organizational change to make sure that you are consistent on ESG, that you are consistent on issues, that you are operating in accordance with your values and your beliefs and your brand. And so Steve, I kind of go back to the top, your point, which I think is interesting around brand gravity. That brand gravity is in many ways the relationship, the magnetism between I have a relationship with this organization because I understand what it does, I believe in what it does, and I can see that evidence. And I think CCOs, a lot of what they do today is about finding a way to convey that in a way that's clear and compelling.
Do good, run the marathon, build brand gravity. I like that. That's great advice. And Rob, you said you've got a really unique point that you said, my friend, in the access you have to the data and to the research. But not only that, it's like every time I go to talk to you, I don't know where in the world you're going to be, Middle East, Europe. I mean, you're getting that context and the real-time counsel with CCOs using all that insights that the Harris poll gleans. As you're counseling CCOs around the world, as you're listening to them, what's your advice to CCOs on the path ahead?
Three things. So first and foremost, the most successful companies that either we work with or that we've been able to analytically model, they balance two things extremely well, right? And that's the ambition of the company, right? So its growth prospects, its vision, its products, with its character, right? It's very much around kind of the culture, the ethics, the citizenship behind it, and you need to have both of those elements. So if you're a company that's only ambition, no character, there's going to be a lot of potholes. It's going to be a bumpy ride, right? Even if you make some money. Flip side is if you're a company that's all character, no very low ambition, or the ambition's not working, it's going to be very problematic. You're either not a for-profit company, or you're out of or you're bankrupt, right? So that's the first thing. And just even having that simple lens, analytically, you want more depth, you want a lot more stakeholders, a lot more markets, but it's a simple framework. The second is when you're thinking about telling that story of ambition and character, what are the 2 or 3 examples from your organization that really tell that story, right? Where can you see that clear intersection between what you do in your business and how you do your business, right? And then the third thing is the number of blind spots that we still see for companies today is remarkable, especially as companies are looking at as you look at companies' digital footprints and the changing nature of reputational risk. And I'm not talking just like what's on Twitter or social media. I'm talking about the digital landscape at large. Like if you're searching for a company, there are massive blind spots for most companies. And they're only getting bigger if people aren't addressing them. So it's those 3 things together, I think, are the main takeaways.
That's really, really sound advice, and what a fascinating discussion. So I want to thank Rob Jekielek of the Harris Poll, Eliot Mizrachi of Page for today's fascinating discussion. And I also want to point out the research that we're talking about is available on page.org. And hopefully we gave you plenty of insights today that will help you create positive brand gravity for your own brands and the brands you serve. So tune in next time to hear more conversation and insights from tremendous leaders and thought leaders like Eliot and Rob. I'm Steve Halsey. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Building Brand Gravity.